Testing, 1, 2. Testing. Okay. Good morning. This is Brother Larry Cochran coming from South Amland Baptist Church. Welcome this morning to our online Bible study. I remind you, after Sunday today, for the next couple of Sundays, we will not be broadcasting. We'll start back the first Sunday in September. For the last several weeks, we've been looking at the Ten Commandments. We're going to close out our study this morning with commandment number 9 and number 10. And those are, I read from the book of Exodus, chapter 20. It says, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. And then number 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or his maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. So what we could say here, and we're talking about what God tells us to do at this particular point, is to honor our neighbor's reputation. And secondly, to also honor him in our heart, in the sense of not taking anything from him. So God commands us here in this sense that it's a sense of our own character. What he talks about here, the character we might have. And so it's about to honor his character and his integrity. And in this point, that's how we can say that we love God by obeying God. Now that's a pretty uniform theme throughout the Old and New Testament. The best way to honor God, the best way to show that we love God, is simply to obey him. We find out through the Old and New Testament, especially the Old Testament, that some of the most serious crimes committed in the Old Testament, most serious things that occurred is when people chose not to honor God and not to obey God. So, what it tells us here, we're going to look at what we call the importance of true speech. And someone has wisely said, our speech reveals our character. Now, you might stop for a second and wonder who said that. It's not necessarily said in those words, but there is a person who alluded to that particular truth. We find it in Matthew chapter 12, verses 34 through 37. Obviously, it's Jesus himself. And he has this to say about telling the truth and about how what we say can reveal the character, our inner person of who we are, our inner personality. He says here in verse 34, says, you brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. The good man brings good things out of his good stored up in him, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored in him. But I tell you that men will give account on the day of judgment for every careless word they have spoken. For by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned. This is part of what we call a Sermon on the Mount. So Christ says, if you want to know what a man is really like, what you like inside, down deep inside where he lives, listen to what he says. Listen to how he bears with the thing of telling the truth versus lying. Let's put it like that. We've all known individuals in our life that we know that they just can't seem to tell the truth. My grandmother once said years ago about some individuals that climb a tree and tell a lie rather than stand on the ground and tell the truth. I'm sure that's an old saying. It's not something that originated with her, something she's heard, something I obviously heard down through my life, and you probably have too. So this ninth commandment will charge us to do what? To take care of a good person's name, not to do anything to defame it in the sense of telling a lie about it. So, and generally speaking, we're talking about not lying. But here in this particular text, it's a more specific type of lying it's talking about. Now, Christ obviously expands this concept into meaning to be truthful and not lie at all. One of the major things that I am aware of and I've sought to be throughout my Christian experience is being an individual who tells the truth, who seeks to always be truthful, and seeks to be true. And I've often said to a close friend of mine in this church, when I tell you something and it turned out to be false, at the time I said it to you, I believed it to be true and found out later that it was not and came back corrected that. So part of our Christian witness is to be people who are persons of the truth. And people who don't tell the truth or have a problem with the truth are the kind of people we do not trust. It also bear a factor in our ability to witness as a Christian. If I was, just someone who was known to not be telling the truth, could not keep his word, for example, and simply was always caught telling something that wasn't true. So it falls in the category here of not truth telling. It goes beyond just that, but it says, I remember, I think about the children we've taught here in our church, and what we teach in Sunday school quite often is about do not lie, but it goes, as I talk about, it goes beyond that. The real nature of this particular commandment is about lying in a particular setting. It's about giving false testimony in a court of law, and that's a setting we have here. It's what we call perjury. Telling something in a court of law, when we took an oath to tell the truth, we know we're not telling the truth, and we're purposely telling a lie or telling falsehood. Now, there were 16 crimes in the Jewish law set that could end in death, and so it's extremely important that people tell the truth. Even in our own day and time, there are crimes that it could end in the death of the criminal. For example, murdering someone else, or kidnapping, for example. And it used to be in many cases the rape of a woman. But we recognize the fact that a person who would falsify the information could put a person's life in jeopardy. So there were 16 different crimes where the penalty in the Old Testament was death. And I'm going to briefly run through them real quickly. There are only 2 that we would recognize. There are about 14 that we wouldn't recognize. I think it's so strange that it would be for death. But right at the top of the list is murder, for example. And then number 2, what really I thought was kind of interesting was a person who attacked his parents in a physical sense or cursed them, in that sense of cursing them, could end in the penalty of having to die for that. Remember, God says back earlier in the commandments to honor our parents. And so if you dishonor them by attacking them in some physical sense, or maligning them, reviling them, you could end in death. And being disobedient to parents could also end in the death of a Jewish person. And we go on down the list. We have kidnapping we know about. Negligence resulting in death. Of course, in the Old Testament, we had witchcraft and sorcery. Human sacrifice, incest, adultery itself, any kind of homosexual acts, bestiality, which is sex with beasts, prostitution by a priest's daughter, blaspheming God could end in death, a false prophet who said, I'm speaking for God, but was not speaking for God, perjury in a capital offense, capital trial. For example, someone's being tried for their life and it was proved that you perjured and gave false testimony, you could end up being put to death because you gave false testimony. And then trespass in certain parts of God's sanctuary could end in death. So you can see right away why the Jews had required 2 to 3 witnesses when they gave testimony in, for example, a capital offense trial. And so God is very forthright and very to the point about the fact that the truth needs to be spoken. And I point that's pretty much to the trial itself. But I do know and understand what the Bible teaches, what Jesus taught. Christ expects his followers, his believers, to be truthful in their speech, regardless of where they're at, regardless of who they're speaking with or to, whether they're under oath or not. We are required to speak the truth. And sometimes it says to speak the truth in love. And so we have to, reading here it says this can require, can be understood broadly to address the way we speak of or to our neighbors, for example. It commands honesty in our words and actions, a commitment to integrity and right respect in our neighbors. And it says in both these presence and in their absence we're to respect them. So we may never be called to testify in a court. I have been called to testify in court a few times in my life. And I was very, very careful to make sure that I spoke the truth to the question being asked and that I spoke the truth fully to the question being asked, not reserve anything back. And so So we have to understand that everyday moments as we interact with the people around us, as believers especially, with fellow believers, even non-believers, we're to deal with them in a forthright, truthful manner, because that will shape our life in either a positive or negative fashion, or shape their life in either a positive or negative fashion. I've often spoken of the fact that the decision making in life, I said to my granddaughter not too long ago, the kind of decision we make in life should always have positive consequences as much as we can, and do everything we can to avoid making those kind of decisions that carry negative consequences. So this is very true. This is part where I take it from. So we look at the third commandment. It said we should not take God's name in vain. We should honor his name. This particular commandment here tells us we should honor the good name of our neighbors and not do anything to dishonor that name, as what we say about him to others, for example. And so we're careful about that. So it's important to understand that sometimes when we who would not contemplate murdering maybe our neighbor, but we might get down to what we call character assassination, and so that happens all too freely sometimes. So we're going to look now at what are probably four not so obvious forms of lying about our neighbors or our fellow believers. One is called reviling, what we call inappropriate flattery, where it has something in the background that we're trying to gain some advantage. It's not a real sincere flattery. It's insincere to manipulate the person we're talking about. And then there's the one of silence. We're just not saying anything at all. And then misattribution. We'll get quickly in this thing here. So let's talk about reviling. I took the time to look up what we call the biblical definition of reviling, and it's probably pretty close to what we'd understand it to be today. It says to criticize or abuse someone with harsh, insulting, or contemptuous language. The intention is to shame that person, insult that person, or to degrade that person. And of course, that's the opposite of the biblical principles that Jesus taught. And here are some of those principles he taught. We are to love our neighbor, right? We are to respect our neighbor, and we are to act in gentleness toward other individuals and people. And so you see that's directly in contrast with that. So we look at that definition there of what it is. And so, matter of fact, what I read to you there in Matthew 5, 21, 26, Jesus there directly speaks to this concept of reviling our neighbor and saying evil things about them. And so what I've come to understand is sometimes if you go online and maybe a Christian wrote something about someone else online, or on Facebook or someplace, sometimes it's awfully hard to tell the difference between the believer and the non-believer, because they basically maligned or reviled that individual. Sometimes a politician, sometimes maybe their own pastor, or some other public figure, or some neighbor itself. Why would they do that? First of all, it's an affront to God. It's directly in contradiction to God's command. But the real reason is it's not face-to-face. Many people who would not say something bad about someone or ugly to someone face-to-face would choose to do it behind their back. Either speak to someone else or put it online, because we're not looking at them face-to-face. Most people do not like confrontation, but they don't mind writing something that's not true or reviling towards someone if they don't have to look at them in the eyes. They can just go on their keyboard, write all that in, and not have to deal with looking in the eyes of the person they're talking about. And so it goes on to talk about other ways that we might revile. We might revile with sarcasm, tears down our neighbor with a wink and a laugh. We might revile, correcting our children by shaming them to our tone and the language we use to do that. We might revile with our carefully crafted prayer requests that the smokescreen of gossip, of slander. We might revile on emails and text threads and bumper stickers and casual conversation. And it's setting all too many believers take the opportunity to raise this nasty kind of attitude by themselves up, by pushing others down. So because they're not face to face. So understand, Christ does not like reviling. He doesn't like us to be that way toward individuals. He wants us to continue to have a loving attitude toward them, a forgiving attitude toward them, and a gentle attitude toward them. We talk about gentleness. But who does love reviling? Well, Satan does. So when we revile, in the way that I've defined it, we're acting more like the children of Satan and less like the children of God. Because that's what we look like, what we act like. And over in James 3:10 it says this. James writes, says, out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. There's James saying exactly what I've been saying. Blessing and cursing should not come out of the same mouth. When we're reviling someone, we're cursing someone, whether it be in words or actual cursing statements, tearing down the character, tearing down the reputation. We're acting in total opposition to how Christ teaches every believer how we ought to live and interact with those around us. And so obviously it's a sin if we do that. And so that's what we're looking at here. And it goes on to talk about the example of Jesus Christ. He set an example. He did not revile or insult others, as we talk about. Instead, he responded, it says in 1 Peter 2:22-23, he committed no sin, nor was a deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. That's in 1 Peter 2:22-23. So if anyone ever had a real reason to revile, and just stacked on top of one another, Jesus had it, but he didn't take that direction. Even from the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So he didn't revile them. He corrected them on their sin and pointed out what they were doing wrong, but he didn't insult them in the sense of reviling we talk about here. And quickly, we're going to go to the sin of flattery. That's what I talked about. It's a deceitful way of building somebody up. It misrepresents real flattery, but it's a deceitful way to build someone up. It's a manipulation used on that person to gain advantage over them, to gain some favor from them, to secure that favor, but it's artificially gain that favor from them. And so that's what we call deceitful flattery. Nothing wrong with real and sincere flattery. I'm not saying that. We're talking about the deceitful type. We all know what that's like. The person who would flatter someone in order to, who's not being sincere, but in order to gain some kind of advantage over them by building them up and maybe even building up their trust to have them because they've been flattered them so much. Now, number 3 is the sin of silence. That's one we don't often think about. I can tell you honestly, I really thought about that much either until I read the Sunday school lesson. And the sin of flattery, the sin of silence, is when we ought to speak up in defense of our brother in Christ or someone else who we know there's being a lie being told about them, false gossip going on. But we remain silent. And sometimes because we remain silent can be worse and more brutal than the reviling, the going on, because the gossip being told, because we're not coming to defense of someone we care about, we love, somebody in the church, for example, and so we don't speak up, and our silence can almost be deafening because we haven't spoken up, we haven't defended that individual. The last one here, we talk about the sin of misattribution, and so this we can look back. We might think we looked at the third commandment. We talked about how a person might say, well, the ought to get other people to trust his decision and go the direction he wants to go. He'll say, God led me to do that, when in fact perhaps God didn't do that. That's that misattribution. It adds more strength to your what you're stating, and that's misattribution. In that sense, is misattribution of God's blessing and command. But this one here is very close to that, but here we're misattribution of someone else, to gain their confidence. Or maybe we've laid out some kind of plan, that we're going to do, and we say, well, this is the right plan, and you should follow this with me, and so we misattribute that plan, having come from someone else, come from us when it came from someone else, for example. We've probably all been in meetings, perhaps, where our boss was laying out some kind of new plan, some kind of new direction the company was going to go, and you knew that you're the one who came up with that, but he's kind of saying it's his plan, and never says anything about the fact that you helped bring that into being. That's misattribution. That's saying, I did, this is something I did when in fact it's someone else who actually came up with it. And that's kind of a simple that kind of concept. So we're shifting that away. But here's the most dangerous one we look at is shifting the blame for sin. We might, here's how that works so subtly. When we're caught in some kind of sin, we're caught doing something, we'll say, well, this person made me do that. It might be, might we talk about our spouse or a child, or a parent, some coworker, a boss, a friend, whoever it might be. I think of old Flip Wilson show. I'm about to date myself, but Flip Wilson used to say on his show at some point, a part of his comedy routine was the devil. The devil made him do it, and so that's misattribution. In the sense we were to go that way. That's probably true in one sense. The devil led us to do that, but here we look at what we're talking about. King David's response when Nathan confronts him about his adultery of Bathsheba is the proper way to respond when we've been confronted with sin. David does not yell at the top of his lungs, "It's Bathsheba's fault. She's the reason that I did it." No, how does he respond? If you go in 2 Samuel verse 12 and 13, he virtually says, "I have sinned against the Lord." That's the proper way to deal with sin rather than say, someone else caused me to do that. We always have a choice about that. Have a choice whether we go into that sin or not if we're a believer. Now, if you're not a believer, you can say no to sin only so long as sin overpowers it, because we're enslaved. An unbeliever is enslaved to sin, and most times will choose that without any thought whatsoever, even resisting it. But a believer can resist the power of Christ, and so we need to say clearly that that it wasn't someone else that caused that to happen, that we caused it to happen ourselves. So he goes on to warn. Jesus warns in Matthew 12:36-37. I said, I tell you, on the day of your judgment, people will give account for every careless word that you speak, for your words will be justified by justified, and your words will also be condemned. Now, command number 10, we're going to quickly shift over there. And that's the one about do not being coveted. So we find this sin of a different nature there in number 10. And we could say in one sense that the first 10 commandments progress from don't do it to don't say it to number 10, don't even think it about covetousness, because no matter what we're doing, we never set ourselves out to sin against God or someone else about first desiring something out of bounds, something that's for ourselves. You look at Adam and Eve's sin. They wanted, Satan said, you can be like God, you have what God has. They wanted something that was out of bounds for them. You look at Cain and Abel, and we find Cain killing Abel. He wanted something out of bounds. He wanted God's favor. He wanted God's blessing. Abel had gotten it, and Cain hadn't. And so he was after something that out of bounds for him that he couldn't have. So if we look at this whole thing, we turn this around from when it talks about do not covet. We put that in a positive sense. I could say be content. We got to be content with what God has given to us, the blessing God has brought our way, and not what someone else has, how God may have blessed them in some form or fashion, and think what they have is what we want, and even to some plan to work out how we're going to get what they want, what they got. And that's, of course, about sealing the rest of that. So the less content we are with our own possessions and our own relationships or circumstances around us, the less inclined we are to be generous. So we want to hang on to those things. The Bible teaches generosity, to take care of the poor and the hurt and the needy. Not only in prayer in that sense, but if we can, in a real physical sense, monetarily or some other form or fashion. But non-contentment says, I'm going to hold on to what I got. I'm not going to share it with the world around me. As a matter of fact, I want more of what I got from that other person who has what I want. And so we need to learn contentment. So that is a factor we have there. So I'm going to close out with our warning this morning. I'm going to quote here from the Sunday school lesson. So Jesus warned, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. That's Luke chapter 12, verse 15. It says, perhaps the most sinister aspect of covenant is the way that it keeps your eyes fixed on the horizontal plane. When we reject the 10th word or 10th commandment, we say in effect, I will cast down my eyes on dirt. From whence cometh my help? My help cometh from the world. Rather than desire the well-being of my neighbor, I desire his stuff, his relationships, and circumstances. It's impossible to want the best for another while wanting those things. So the great loss of covenant life is that it keeps love of self as a primary concern rather than on God where it belongs. And so that's the study this morning. I remind you we will not be on next Sunday or the following Sunday, but the first Sunday in September. Have a God bless day, and we'll see you the first Sunday in September.